Dungeons & Dragons, an incredibly difficult thing to pull off, but when done right, can allow for some of the most memorable moments in any campaign. In a setting full of magic and knights and barbarians, horror isn't always the first thing that comes to mind when writing a setting, but that is what can make it so incredibly striking when it is used. Being a horror content creator myself, first and foremost, I cannot help but try to integrate horror into my own campaigns at key moments where I feel it'll help elevate my stories and create moments that my players will never forget. Which always begs the question, how? How does one begin to explore topics of horror in a naturally chaotic and unpredictable game such as Dungeons and Dragons? First things first, let's address the elephant in the room. If you came here looking for a discussion about specifically running horror-centered campaigns, my biggest piece of advice is that D&D may not always be the system you want to use. There absolutely are ways to create dark campaigns with moments of horror, as we will discuss, but for very horror-centered campaigns where you always want there to be a sense of tension, systems like Call of Cthulhu exist to better complement that GMing style. Now that that's been said though, what about those moments where horror can elevate D&D? Those moments where a normally powerful party, confident and ready to take on anything thrown their way, suddenly feel a unique dread towards the circumstances you've given them.
I mean, think about it. A party in a normally lighthearted world suddenly finds themselves being stalked by an unknown creature in the Underdark, or separated an ever-changing maze full of horrors. The element of surprise you have when plunging your party into an unexpected horror session is such a powerful tool that you can use in your campaigns. The fear of the unknown is baked into our DNA, and to take a group who is at their most comfortable playing with their math rocks and force them into uncharted territory where they could lose their lives at any moment will absolutely create a long-lasting impression. There are obviously some limitations to this though. High-level campaigns in particular struggle with this, as most threats at that point can be handled with a flick of the wrist. But for low to mid-range levels, this is one of my favorite tools in my toolbox to break out when I'm feeling extra sinister. But before we get to that, how does one set up an entire campaign themed around horror? Wouldn't your players become desensitized over time? Surely you can't keep them on their toes 24/7.
Of course, and that is why I feel it is important first when implementing horror into a campaign to understand what that could mean. If you are building a horror-themed campaign, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to constantly throw horrifying threats at your party every session, such as werewolves and vampires. A horror campaign can more so use world building to its advantage to create a consistent feeling of dread with occasional highs and lows. Think of worlds and stories like Bloodborne. That game, while being an action-focused RPG, is able to explore topics of horror through its world and story, with the occasional scares sprinkled in. A naturally morbid, grimdark setting can frighten your players by making them think about the world they're trapped in. It sets an expectation for bad things to happen, even if they don't, which can create tension. Tension you, as the GM, can eventually release every time they encounter more overt threat. I've run a couple campaigns like this in the past, and they are a blast when done right. In a setting where it feels like everything is out to get you and the world itself is not safe, it can lead to these moments of immense satisfaction for your players when they do manage to triumph over whatever you throw their way. The horror here isn't just for tormenting your players, but rather to give them something massive and beyond them to overcome.
The goal for your world could be to expunge the horrors corrupting the land. For example, one of my previous campaigns, Plague of Darkness, was set in a grim dark world based on Bloodborne and Castlevania. The undead ran rampant throughout the land, and the party's goal was to find the vampire overlord responsible for this chaos and kill him. A seemingly impossible task. Keyword, seemingly. This band of adventurers could theoretically do it, and that's what drives them to confront the nightmarish world before them. The horror may be abundant in the setting, but it was an obstacle the party could theoretically overcome if they try. Just because the world is horror-centric doesn't mean it has to be a world entirely devoid of hope.
In a setting like this, for all the triumphs your party has, if you want that feeling of dread towards something larger than them to linger, you can also do so as a result of the setting. In tabletops such as Call of Cthulhu, one very consistent theme is the idea of the smaller victories. The party takes down a great foe, only to learn that they were part of something bigger. Threats and beings exist beyond the scope of what the party thought originally possible, and those threats can bring a new horror as a result of the mere realization of their existence. Perhaps these threats can be introduced in what would be moments of triumph. Perhaps a party, bloodied and exhausted from a fight with a great foe, celebrates their victory only for something new and terrifying to appear. At this moment, they're caught off guard, all their tools expended, their hit points low. That is a prime opportunity for horror. Of course, moments like this should be sparing, and you should only ever commit to them if you have a plan for how they're going to get out of it. This hypothetical is merely some food for thought about how you could take advantage of a setting such as this to create unique moments of horror, even when they are not expected.
Something else to consider is the misconception some people have that a horror-themed campaign should be high tension at all times, which obviously cannot be realistically maintained in the long term. Your party's emotional spectrum isn't limitless, it's kind of got a gauge to it. If you max it out, eventually they become desensitized to your world. However, keeping them on a constant level of minor anxiety is your sweet spot. The party, knowing something could be sprung on them, even if nothing is there to threaten them at that time, is the exact place you want them to be. Because even when you're not trying to scare them, their own anxiety and fear of the unknown is keeping them invested and watching for the actual instances of horror that you have planned. Now, that doesn't mean you can just kick back and relax. You have to give them a reason to have the anxiety. You kind of have to back up your threats.
At the end of the day, if you want to scare your players, the tried and true method is to give them an overt, horrific threat that they will remember. Something that will linger in the back of their minds after, making them paranoid of seeing something like it in future sessions. And the way this can be done is by taking advantage of all the elements at your disposal to create that atmosphere. Be descriptive. Horror is in the details. If the party is faced by a monster of incomprehensible nature, you should try and paint a vivid picture through your words and descriptions of the monster to make it feel real and tangible. If you have access to music or sound effects in your session, use those to paint an even more vivid picture. D&D at the end of the day is a game of theater of the mind, and for those key moments where you want to scare your players in the most direct way possible, going the extra mile can make all the difference.
Don't skip out on the nitty-gritty. Describe the noises they hear, the shadow darting out of sight, the chills running up their spine, and I promise you they will feel those things. You need to throw your party off beat in order to stress them out. Rhythmic consistency will breed comfort, so you need to throw the rhythm into disarray. Break the norms, and their stress levels will rise accordingly. That's why horror sessions in a largely non-horror campaign can be so effective, because you're breaking the rhythm of what the party expects and throwing them into something completely unexpected. That's an interesting thought though, right? A horror segment in a non-horror setting? A natural follow-up to that would be, why? Which, fair question. Why would you want a horror section in your non-horror setting? I like to view it as our campaign is a meal we're cooking in the kitchen. Our emotional spectrum serves as an array of different spices and ingredients. Can we get through a full campaign without relying on the full emotional range? Yes, obviously, of course you can. Just as you could cook a meal without using every single spice in the cabinet. But variety is the spice of life, my friend, and changing things up from week to week is a great way to keep things fresh and engaging. Something you should consider though is just like with cooking, don't just throw in horror at complete random. Your goal is to disrupt the beat of the story, but not totally destroy the rhythm entirely. Good horror follows its own rhythm. A horror session should be unexpected, but not completely out of the blue.
One simple way I like to explore this idea is the idea of alluding to moments of horror long before they happen, making it so when moments of horror occur in a campaign, they can be shocking and intense while also feeling natural and properly built up to. Perhaps there is a specific location the party is meant to travel to with horrifying tales of what lurks within long before they arrive there. Maybe they're dealing with a villain whose history of evil acts is well known before they meet him. There are a plethora of ways you can foreshadow future moments of horror without having them come about completely at random.
As an example, in a previous campaign of mine, my main inspirations going into it were both Xenoblade Chronicles and Monster Hunter. Hardly horror-centric settings, but there are elements of those titles that some might find scary. My campaign reflected this. It centered mostly on the feelings of excitement and a lust for adventure with minor instances of horror sprinkled in. Wide open fields with emerald green grass were met with invigorating music and epic combat sections, whereas themes of body horror and psychological horror would be mentioned by NPCs in passing as part of the main story and the world lore. We eventually came to a point where the party was tasked with investigating an abandoned laboratory of an evil scientist bent on creating the perfect soldier. This is the moment that we disturbed the rhythm. Just last week, we're running around a massive open field slaying larger-than-life monsters, and now we're in a claustrophobic metal corridor that groans and creaks with each step. Suddenly, they're hearing noises, seeing shadows in the corner. The music is no longer bright and vivid, but deep and foreboding. That, coupled with introducing a home-brewed monster that they've never seen before and have no idea how it works, now they are completely out of their element and fully engaged in the session.
As a player in this group who attended that session, I can say from experience that this change in formatting made the session incredibly memorable. The power we normally felt throughout the entire campaign felt as though it was taken from us as we dreadfully roamed the quiet halls of the complex. It was a refreshing break in what we were used to that came at a natural point in the story.
We had been in a bit of a rut, so I decided to spice things up, because the most important thing to remember when running a campaign is to keep things fresh, and a horror session is a perfect thing to add to your repertoire to stay fresh when things are feeling stale. Lo and behold, it ended up being one of my favorite sessions of that entire campaign. A little dash of horror can go a long way.
And that is how you can effectively incorporate horror elements into a D&D campaign. Exploring horror and darker themes is perhaps one of my favorite parts of the GMing process, so I hope you found this video helpful in your own GMing endeavors. With all that said though, this has been D&Design, and we'll see you in our next video. Keep creating and roll on, adventurers.